Vampire myths, even as they have formed in the popular imagination, are essentially anti, or perhaps more exactly, counter-Islamic in origin. They are this in some obvious ways, but they are more the product of very deep fissures in the civilizational and religious tectonics that shape the dynamics of Christian-Islamic exchange. They come out of a very deep psychology. They give expression to some profound undercurrents in that religious shadow world. We should suspect this from the outset. These myths are conspicuously full of religious symbolism, deliberately given intensity by themes of sex and death. The vampire stories, that is, express a dark mythology that comes out of Christo-Islamic demonization of religious opponents. In this case, a product of Romano-Turkish tensions, largely. Almost all of the various motifs that assemble around the figure of the vampire can be explained in this way, along with the historical and geographical context. But it is more than a simple and pedestrian demonization. Everybody denigrates their enemies. In this case, it takes root in a deep substrata of imaginal worlds, obscured from us by religious exotericisms. To be more exact, the vampire is a complex of ideas and motifs growing out of Christian projections and reflections of the Muslim other. It is a mythology about otherness and contraries. It was this before it was developed into its familiar form by Bram Stoker, but his agenda, conscious or unconscious, was counter-Islamic too. Stoker was close friends with Gladstone. It was Gladstone who fatefully turned British foreign policy against the Ottoman Empire. Gladstone and his circle, among them Stoker, were viciously and axiomatically anti-Turk. Stoker's story grows from anti-Turk soil. But again, it is not a straightforward matter because myth is not parody or propaganda, and Stoker's politics or any political context doesn't account for the constellations of symbolism that take shape. This account of othering, moreover, has little to do with current sociological theories. It is more complex and more interesting. The initial impetus of the mythology was in the 18th century, when a mass hysteria gripped the Balkans in this form, and it was first planted in, or first emerged from perhaps, the European imagination. The vampire in some form is a very ancient and very widespread motif, after all. Its particular development in European ideas is what concerns us here. In Gothic literature, the story enters from Byron's unfinished novel of 1819, itself based on folk stories from Greece. The villain is the character Augustus Darvel, whose transformation into a vampire happens, of course, in a Turkish cemetery. Let's consider some very basic points about this mythology by way of giving a sketch of the case. First, geographical proximity. Vampires come from Transylvania, do they not? Notice that these myths come from the geographical border of Christendom and the Islamic world, the Ottoman Empire specifically. They are the products of the tensions between the two civilizations. The vampire legends move into Western Europe from the Balkans, from Greece, and from other Eastern European Christian-Islamic borderlands. There is no question that the geographical locus of this mythology is those parts of Europe exposed for centuries to the pressures of Ottoman expansion. Second, the vampire myths are said, in some genealogies, to be based upon or allude to Vlad the Impaler. Vlad's infamous cruelty was in fact dedicated to the protection of Christianity in Eastern Europe from the Turks. This cruel figure is projected onto the vampire, the demonization of the victim. Already we see that the othering is not straightforward. Third, and related, vampires have no reflection in a mirror, because they are already reflections. This mythology is about otherness and projection. One thing going on here is the demonization of Islam's similarities to Christianity. The Christian response is, whatever the Muslims have in common with us is a diabolical inversion. Inversion of symbols is a key move in this mythology. We notice at once that the vampire mythology is dripping with religious symbolism, but next we notice that this symbolism is typically inverted. It is sinister or left hand. Mythologies like this are related to the very serious religious business of cursing. Of course, vampires hate crucifixes. This is plain enough, isn't it? Vampires are antithetical to Christianity and vice versa. The Muslim conceived in a sinister aspect as exactly anti-Christian and burnt by holy water. That's plain enough too. The most potent weapons against the fiend are the symbols of the Christian faith. By definition, vampires drink blood. On a crude level, this is no doubt a play on the idea that the Turks are bloodthirsty, but also alludes to, parodically, the fact that Muslims don't drink blood. Blood is forbidden under halal food laws. Thus do vampires drink blood, inversions and reversals. In the mysterious processes that give shape to a mythology like this, there are inversions and reversals. In tectonic metaphors, folds and anticlines form in the bedrock. More generally, no doubt, this motif reports the actual savagery of battle in such borderlands. War often degenerates into cannibalism, since vampirism is a type of cannibalism, and this happens even in our own times. Make no mistake, a mythology like this is a byproduct of monstrous events, a transmutation of suffering, an epiphany of the grotesque. We don't need to rehearse episodes of horror from the history of that part of the world, nor underline the deep bitterness and long memories of the cultures that collided through waves of war and conquest and counter-conquest. The fact that vampires come out at night requires more explanation, but is part of the same design. This important motif concerns the Muslim fast of Ramadan. The vampire sleeps all day and emerges when the sun goes down. So do Muslims during the fast, or so it can seem to outsiders. In Islam, the darkness of night, the night vigil, is characteristic of piety. Here we see that elements of spirituality are cast as satanic. It is a simple light-dark dichotomy, surely, but the allusion is to the rhythms of the fast, which indeed inverts the normal order of things, since life is revived at sunset. Light and dark, sun and moon, the full moon, the anti-sun, these are elements in this mythology. The metal silver too. The metal silver appears in many vampire motifs. Silver is the characteristic sacred metal of Islam, the metal of the moon, an extension of the lunar symbolism. A note about the black cape. Muslims, both male and female, wearing black capes is a common sight in traditional Islamic culture. Travellers often describe them as bat-like. I've seen this myself at Ramadan, the movement of women and men draped in black around the streets. In the Ottoman context, moreover, witness the capes worn in the influential and very notable Mevlevi order. The symbolism developed in Mevlevi spirituality is very suggestive in this regard. The Sufi murid is often described as dead, and indeed as living dead, and wears a black cape, a herka, to signify the tomb. The distinctive Mevlevi fez, the kulla, signifies the tombstone, as Rumi and other Mevlevi authorities tell us. The vampire as the living dead is specifically counter-Sufi in this context. The Islam that is being countered in this mythology is specifically that known through the Ottomans. The Gnostic element in vampire mythology, to which some like to point, should always be understood through the mediation of Sufism here. We might suspect that the eroticism of the mythology enters with this mediation as well, since Mevlevi spirituality, like much Sufism, deploys an erotic symbolism. That conjunction of sex and death is exactly Mevlevi. The Mevlevis, and Ottoman society generally, celebrated the death of Rumi as his wedding night, the nuptial of the grave. That was a pervasive symbolism in Ottoman Islam. How these various elements come together is a question of subterranean processes, subductions. They form in a bed of local legend and folklore and fundamental, visceral, bitter, dark, unconscious tensions that operate in Christian Islamic discourse. These are tectonic pressures. We find such myths as these on the fault lines, They are born out of hatred, confrontation, generations of mutual misunderstanding and mutual cursing. We can compare it to certain legends and myths that surrounded the Jews as other in certain times and places. But the deeper strata opens into our collective shadows. The mythology has roots in the murky, chthonic caverns shared by both religions. The fascination concerns some very fundamental structures where profound things, and not just the Turkish border, are unresolved, nor are they easily resolved. Islam is what is on the other side of the mirror. It is not actually an other, but rather a despised version of the self. This is why the sociological theories are inadequate and tepid here. This is a mythology about an irresistible and seductive evil. One further observation. This mythology comes from and or refers to those same parts of Europe, Eastern Europe bordering the Ottomans, which received a transplantation of alchemy. The colours of the vampire mythos, as it has developed anyway, are conspicuously black, white and red, alchemical colours. But this is an anti-alchemy. Notice its vitalist themes. The alchemist and the vampire have unnatural longevity, but for the vampire, blood is the elixir. The vampire hunter is like an anti-alchemist who must put an end to these evil transmutations. It is useful to consider the vampire mythos in this context. It is part of the same frame of cross-cultural ideas and appropriations. Notice that the vampire hunter is not a priest, but he does a priestly job, like a lay exorcist. For all its religious symbolism, this is actually a secular mythology. This is what is peculiar and unusual here. The crosses, the holy water, the Bibles, and yet a vampire is not a demon. The hero is not a cleric. The drinking of blood is surely a sinister inversion of the life-giving sacrament, yet the church is missing from the story usually. The vampire is a count, a nobleman of aristocratic class. In Murnau's entirely Germanic adaptation, Nosferatu, it is Count Oriok who resides in his castle in the borderlands of the Carpathian Mountains. The intense religiosity of the myth is nevertheless secular. It is not born out of theology as such. It is an aristocratic mythology. The forces shaping it are passional, not intellectual. None of this prevents anyone from enjoying the vampire as a figure of Gothic horror. We tame our nightmares. None of this symbolism is overt. You can watch 100 vampire movies and never suspect it. But we might better appreciate the background, or rather the undercurrents, the hidden seams of the vampire mythology if we approach it not as an unattached item of pop culture, but through a more penetrating archaeology of ideas.